Hello everyone and welcome back for more Amonkhet Limited Review. I'm Nitsa and so far this week I've gone through all of the white, blue, black, and red cards in Amonkhet and given them grades based on how good I think they're going to be in Limited. Today we're looking at the final color, green, and we aren't quite done after today either, as tomorrow I will cover artifacts, multicolored cards, and lands. Before we get into today's discussion of green cards, here's a quick reminder on how I grade these cards. If you've already seen this and want to skip ahead to the discussion of the first green card, you can do so by using a timestamp in the description below. I'm going to be using letter grades in this limited review. That is what the overwhelming majority of people voted for in a Twitter poll that I conducted. If you'd like to see a different method, let me know in the comments below. Anyway, let's go through each of these letter grades, and for each of them, I'll give some examples from Kaladesh block that I would have given these grades. So as you may have expected, A is the best grade that a card can get. Well, A+ is actually, but those are few and far between. A's are cards that are so powerful that they completely shift a game in your favor, almost regardless of the board state. They are also so strong that they pull you into their colors and tempt you to find a way to splash them. They are most frequently made up of rares and mythics, though the occasional uncommon does find its way in there. Some examples of this from Kaladesh block would be cards like Herald of Anguish and Verdurous Gearhulk. These are basically the cards that you most want to open and pick in your first pack because they give your deck such a massive power boost. Next up, we have cards that receive a B. These are still great cards, but not quite as game-warping as A-level cards. This category is made up of cards that should basically always be making the cut in your deck if they're in your color. This includes premium removal and extremely efficient and powerful creatures. Cards at this grade level don't tempt you to change your entire draft the way A-level cards do, but they make the cut 100% of the time in your deck if you're in their colors. Most frequently, these are of uncommon rarity or higher, though sometimes commons get in the mix. Some examples of this from Kaladesh block are Thopter Arrest and Scrapper Champion. Next, there are C-level cards. While A's and B's are the kind of cards you're happy to first pick, C's aren't quite as exciting. They're the kind of card that basically always makes your deck if they're in your color, but aren't incredibly powerful. Here is where you find solid and efficient creatures as well as decent removal, and this is usually what the majority of your deck is actually made up of. Some examples of C-level cards from Kaladesh block are cards like Ether Swooper and Shock. Basically, these are all cards you feel good about having in your deck, but not great about taking super early. So in an ideal world, your deck will be made up entirely of cards in the A through C range. That's something to keep in mind in general as I go through cards in this list and in the other limited review videos. Cards in the D and F range are not cards you generally want in your deck. However, D cards aren't entirely terrible, but they're cards that frequently get cut from your deck and are basically just filler to help you with your curve. Generally, things have to go a little bit wrong during your draft for you to end up with more than a few D cards in your deck, as you are stretching to include every playable card you drafted if they're showing up there. Some examples of this are Ether Inspector and Reservoir Walker. Both of these cards are cards I ended up playing a few times in the format, but I was never very happy to have to do it. Generally, most decks are made up of B's and C's because A's are so rare and D's are mediocre playables that will sometimes make the cut. However, there is a grade even worse than D, obviously, and that is F. These are cards that I consider utterly unplayable and shouldn't end up in your deck for any reason. These are the cards that always seem to be the last cards you pick up in booster packs. Some recent examples of this would be Gonti's Machinations and Take Into Custody. A few more words on grading. There's some more nuance to it in many cases. I will give some cards a grade range instead of just a single letter grade because some cards are stone unplayable in some decks but become very good if your deck meets certain requirements. A good example of this from Ether Revolt is Efficient Construction. This card just gets a straight F if you have less than 5 artifacts, but if you get to 10 or more, it suddenly becomes a B. These type of nuances show up from time to time while grading cards, and I will draw your attention to them when we run into cards like it. There are also cards that aren't very good main board, but are pretty good out of the sideboard. For these cards, I will give grades based on how good I think the card would be in my main board, but also a sideboard grade that reflects how happy I am to have that card available out of my sideboard. A good example of this is Takedown, which is a D main board, but a B out of your sideboard. Now, let's get started by looking at the first green card, which is Benediction of Ronis, which is 2 colorless mana and 1 green mana for a sorcery that says, reveal the top 5 cards of your library. You may put a creature card and or an enchantment card from among them into your hand. Put the rest into your graveyard. This is an interesting card that I think is only going to be worth playing if you can consistently draw 2 cards off of it. In other words, your deck needs to have a decent number of enchantments as well as a decent number of creatures. This set does have 2 good enchantment cycles between the cartouches and the trials, but I don't think it will be easy enough to draw 2 off of this just organically. I think you would need at least 4 or so enchantments to feel good about playing this, and that's not going to be a number that you always want. It does have some synergy in a deck with lots of creatures with Embalm because the creatures you put in your graveyard aren't gone forever, but this set, while it has graveyard stuff going on, doesn't have a mechanic like Delirium where you want as many cards in your graveyard as possible. If it did, Benediction of Ronis would be better. As it stands, I think the Benediction is just a D+, because you won't frequently enough get to draw 2 cards off of it, and most of the time you'll only get 1. If you do have a solid number of enchantments, you should by all means play this. Otherwise, I think it is best to be avoided. Next, we have Bitterblade Warrior, which is 1 colorless mana and 1 green mana for a 2/2 Jackal Warrior. It says, you may exert Bitterblade Warrior as it attacks. When you do, it gets +1/+0 and gains Death Touch until end of turn. This is the first time we've seen the exert mechanic in this video, so I'll remind you real quickly what it does. It makes it so you can choose to exert an attacking creature, and that means it doesn't untap during your next untap step, and you get some bonus. In this case, the Bitterblade Warrior goes from being a 2-mana 2/2 to being a 3/2 with Death Touch. 2 mana with 2/2s with upside are basically always playable, and that's what we have here. As I've noted on other cards with exert, basically if a creature does okay on the vanilla test and has some exert upside, it is a playable card, and that's what Bitterblade Warrior does. 2 for a 2/2 is exactly what you want, and the upside here is solid, because it makes it so this warrior can attack even into the latter part of the game, thanks to gaining Death Touch. Now, if your opponent has their own 2/2 to trade, this doesn't feel great, but if your opponent has a couple of 5/5s in play, that's a pretty nice attack. Kind of reminds me of the black card Doomed Operative in Kaladesh that ended up being way better than people thought it was going to be. I think Bitterblade Warrior has the potential to do the same thing, thanks to the fact that it'll sometimes be a 3/2 Death Toucher, just like Doomed Operative. Bitterblade Warrior is going to get a C+, which is the grade I give 2 mana 2/2s with upside. You feel alright about playing this in your green deck, but you shouldn't feel overjoyed about it. Next, we have Cartouche of Strength, which for 2 colorless and 1 green mana is an enchantment or a cartouche, and it says, enchant creature you control. When Cartouche of Strength enters the battlefield, you may have enchanted creature fight target creature an opponent controls. Enchanted creature gets +1/+1 and has trample. Yesterday, we saw the best card in the Trial cycle. Today, we're seeing the best card in the Cartouche cycle, and I don't think it's particularly close, and that's because this one will basically always be a removal spell. If Cartouche of Strength were a 3-mana sorcery that said, target creature you control gets +1/+1 and gains trample until end of turn, and fights another target creature your opponent controls, it would already be a B-, but this is even better than that because it permanently gives the creature +1/+1 and trample. Basically, this is an aura that is also a very high-quality removal spell. It has the added bonus of also bouncing trials and giving you more value from them, like all cartouches. Every green deck would take as many copies of this as it could get, provided that it has around 15 creatures or more. This means that the cartouche is a B, and the only cartouche that I think is going to be first pickable sometimes, and is definitely worth picking early. Next, we have Champion of Ronis, which for 3 generic mana and 1 green mana is a 3/3 Jackal Warrior, and he says, you may exert Champion of Ronis as it attacks. When you do, you may put a creature card from your hand onto the battlefield. 4 mana for a 3/3 is not a very good card on its own, but this creature has a very powerful exert ability. It allows you to play a creature for free from your hand. Obviously, the ideal thing to do here is to drop a 5 or 6 drop for free, but even if you're just getting a free 2 or 3 drop, that's not bad value. Chances are your opponent will try to trade with this as soon as they can so you aren't able to play more free creatures, so the typical thing it will do is get blocked and killed while letting you put a creature into play for free. That's not too bad if the champion at least took something with it. It does, of course, have some downside, and that is the diminishing value that it has in the later part of the game, where it basically just becomes a 4-mana 3/3 because you no longer have cards in your hand, or it is just better to hardcast the big creatures you have. Still, I think this card can have a big enough impact on a game that the champion deserves a B-. I wouldn't take it over premium removal or bombs, but it is better than the majority of the cards in this set. Next, we have Channeler Initiate, which is 1 generic and 1 green mana for a 3/4 human druid, and it says, when Channeler Initiate enters the battlefield, put 3 -1/-1 counters on target creature you control. It can also tap and remove a -1/-1 counter from itself to add 1 mana of any color to your mana pool. This is an interesting card. In the early game, you can play it as a 2-mana 0/1 who can help you ramp. Oh, and it also helps you fix, by the way, since it adds mana of any color, and that's pretty valuable. In the later part of the game, you can get rid of a 1/1 token to play a 3/4 for 2 mana, which isn't bad, and that flexibility is pretty nice. There are also enough payoffs for -1/-1 counters around in this set to have anything that deals with them have some extra value. This particular card, which ramps and fixes you and then eventually becomes a sizable creature in its own right, is very good. And a card I want in basically every green deck I draft in this format, and a worthy first pick, which is good enough for a B+. Next, we have Colossipede. For 4 generic and 1 green, you get a 5/5 vanilla insect. So, yeah, this is a 5-mana 5/5. That's great on the vanilla test. And since it doesn't do anything else, it's just a nice little 5-drop for a green deck. It's not a card you were either excited or sad about having in your deck, but it's a pretty big creature in this set, which makes it good enough for a C+. Don't take it early, but pick them up on the wheel and feel pretty good about it. Next, we have Krokodil of the Crossing, which for 3 generic mana and 1 green is a 5/4 with haste, and it says when Krokodil of the Crossing enters the battlefield, put a -1/-1 counter on target creature you control. Even on its own, if you have no other creatures in play, Krokodil of the Crossing amounts to a 4 mana 4/3 with haste. That's a great creature and would be enough to get this card probably into the high C or low B range, but this Croc has more than that going on. If you have another creature to put the -1/-1 counter on, you now have a 4 mana 5/4 with haste, which is amazing. What's more, and I know I've already said this, but I'm going to say it again, there are creatures who like -1/-1 counters, and you can use them as fuel for various purposes. And if you are putting the counter on one of them, it is actually more upside than downside. All of this combines to make the Krokodil a pretty frightening creature, and not a 4-drop I want to be looking at on my opponent's side of the table on turn 4 in most situations. This Krokodil is good enough to get a B, and will even be first pickable some of the time, though I think taking it around pick 3, 4, or 5 is probably more optimal. Next, we have Defiant Great Ma, who for 2 generic and 1 green mana is a 4/5 hippo, and it says, when Defiant Great Ma enters the battlefield, put 2 -1/-1 counters on target creature you control. It also says, whenever you put 1 or more -1/-1 counters on Defiant Great Ma, remove a -1/-1 counter from another target creature you control. Defiant Great Ma is another great illustration of the flexibility of these creatures that do things with -1/-1 counters. If you have another creature in play you want to put the counters on, Defiant Great Ma is now a 3 mana 4/5, which is pretty terrifying, and that's not going to be a bad option in terms of playing with this card. Just imagine attacking with your 2-drop, getting in for 2, and then dropping this hippo. That's pretty savage. But he comes with an alternate mode, which is that it is a 3 mana 2/3, but one that removes 2 -1/-1 counters from some other creature you control with counters on them, whether they were put there by your opponent or by your own permanents. Obviously, the first mode is a little more explosive, but the second mode isn't bad either, especially because Black-Green is a deck focused on -1/-1 counter synergies. Overall, though, I'm giving this card a C+. Any green deck will play it, but it will be at its best in a Black-Green deck, where it probably moves into B- range, but because it isn't going to be quite as good in the other color pairs, I'm only giving it a C+. Next, we have Defiant Deliverance, which for 1 colorless and 1 green is an instant that says destroy target artifact, and it also has a cycling cost of 1 green mana. This is our first card with cycling. I'll remind you what that does. It says, basically, that you can pay a cost and discard the card to draw a card, and in this case, that's 1 green mana. So, Defiant Deliverance is mostly a sideboard card. There aren't a ton of artifacts in this set, but there are a few, and Defiant Deliverance answers them. The fact that this can only blow up artifacts is pretty bad, though, especially in a format with multiple good enchantment targets. It has cycling, so that makes it a little better than it would be otherwise. If your opponent has no artifact to blow up, you can just cycle it, but there aren't enough artifacts for this to be mainboarded, honestly, and I think it is an F there, and coming out of the board, it is about a C. Next, we have Exemplar of Strength, who for 1 generic and 1 green mana is a 4/4 human warrior, and it says, when Exemplar of Strength enters the battlefield, put 3 -1/-1 counters on target creature you control. It also says, when Exemplar of Strength attacks, remove a -1/-1 counter from it. If you do, you gain 1 life. Exemplar of Strength is another very interesting creature in terms of design, thanks to this interesting way of using -1/-1 counters. The most basic way of playing this is to play it as a 2 mana 1/1, which is pretty bad, but on the next turn it will attack as a 2/2 and you gain 1 life, and it progressively gets larger every time it attacks until it becomes a 4/4, while gaining you a bit of life. This basically means that this is a 2 mana 2/2 with significant upside as it scales in stats as the game progresses. Additionally, if you played it on a 1-drop on turn 1, you can put all the counters on that 1-drop to play a 2 mana 4/4 creature. Kind of a steep cost, but something that's going to be pretty powerful. In the late game, you can do the same thing if what you really need is a larger creature to block or attack. Cards with -1/-1 counters synergies push this card even further. In the end, being a 2 mana 2/2 with significant upside is enough to make this card a B- in my book, the kind of 2-drop that any green deck would love to have, and one that's worth taking relatively early. Next, we have Giant Spider, which is a reprint we've seen a ton of, and for 3 generic and 1 green, it is a 2/4 spider with reach. Our old friend Giant Spider is an okay-ish playable mainboard. It blocks well, and it is particularly good at slowing down your opponent's air game. That said, I don't love playing Giant Spider mainboard in most decks. I would rather be playing 4-drops who are more impactful, and I give it about a D+ as far as mainboard cards go. It's solid out of the sideboard, though, particularly against opponents who plan on amassing aerial armies, and I give it a C for a sideboard card. Next, we have Gift of Paradise, which for 2 generic and 1 green mana is an enchantment aura that is an enchant land, and it says, When Gift of Paradise enters the battlefield, you gain 3 life. Enchanted Land has tap, add 2 mana of any one color to your mana pool. This is a good card. Fixing is always a nice thing to have, and green decks are usually pretty good at it, and having 1 or 2 of these goes a long way in allowing you to splash a 3rd color. That said, I don't recommend playing this unless you are splashing. While it does provide a bit of ramp too, I'm not sure that's enough of a reason to include it. I like that it gains you some life, since the card has 0 immediate impact on the board. Gaining you that additional life is actually relevant because it helps you make up for the fact that your opponent probably just played a 3-drop that did affect the board and is probably going to smash your face in. I think this card is a C, and the kind of card people will be playing in... I think this card is a C, and the kind of card people playing green will like to run just because it opens up your options to take powerful off-color cards like Cast Out and the like, but not everyone will want it in green, because if you're not splashing, it just doesn't seem worth it. Next, we have Greater Sandworm, which for 5 colorless and 2 green is a 7/7 worm, and it says Greater Sandworm can't be blocked by creatures with power 2 or less. It also has 2 generic mana as its cycling cost. We've been seeing this green creatures can't be blocked by creatures with power 2 or less mechanic. It's not even really a mechanic, it's not even a keyword yet, but it's been showing up lately, and it's better than it looks. But in general, this thing isn't incredible. But if your deck is capable of ramping a bit or making the game last long, you could do worse for a 7-drop. Not being able to be blocked by smaller creatures doesn't sound like much, but it makes it significantly more difficult for this worm to be brought down in combat by a bunch of blockers. The worm does something for you that most 7-drops don't, and that's the fact that you can just get rid of it and draw another card with cycling if you draw it in early going, which is almost definitely what you're going to want to be doing if you find it in your opening hand, since you're going to be very far away from the worm coming into play. Overall, I give this worm a C-. It is a decent inclusion in a deck looking for a 7-drop, but not all decks want those. Next, we have Hapatra's Mark, which for 1 green mana is an instant that says target creature you control gains hexproof until end of turn. Remove all -1/-1 counters from it. I don't love this card, mostly because it is only useful in response to an opponent using removal. It doesn't also grant a stats bonus in most cases, meaning it isn't also useful as a combat trick in most cases. Usually cards that grant hexproof also grant a stats bonus, so I'm a little sad this one doesn't, because that's when you really blow out an opponent, when they try to use removal on your guy during combat, and you get to get rid of the removal and pump your guy. This card is a little bit better in black-green decks, which will be putting -1/-1 counters all over its creatures, where it does become something of a combat trick, since you'll be able to take counters off of your guy and thus bump their stats at the same time as granting them hexproof. But in other color pairs, it isn't very good, and it's a marginal playable at best. I'm going to give it a C-. Next, we have Harvest Season, which for 2 colorless and 1 green mana is a sorcery, and it says search your library for up to X basic land cards, where X is the number of tapped creatures you control, and put those cards onto the battlefield tapped. Then, shuffle your library. This is an interesting card that has a design we've never really seen before. This card does absolutely nothing if you can't get your creatures tapped, and yes, in a format with Exert, it does get a little better since your creature you exerted will have to remain tapped, and if you have a few creatures tapped, it does get to be pretty solid. It is another good source of fixing in green, albeit at rare, and sometimes it will also do something crazy like ramp you up to 6 mana on turn 4 so you can play a big monster. But a card like this is pretty bad in most late game scenarios, and because it asks you to jump through hoops to search for even 1 basic land, I don't think I can give this card anything higher than a C. It is a solid source of fixing and will sometimes be way more than that, but not often enough to get higher grade than a C. Next, we have Haze of Pollen, which for 1 generic and 1 green is an instant that says prevent all combat damage that would be dealt this turn, and it also has a cycling of 3 generic mana. Fog effects are pretty bad in most limited formats, and I don't see why things would be any different here. Spending a card for this effect is very rarely worth it, since normally you're not going to be taking any of your opponent's cards when you do it. This does have cycling, so if a draft went really bad, you could do worse on a 23rd card in your deck, since this can at least replace itself. Without cycling, I would give this an F. With it, I guess it deserves about a D-. Next, we have Honored Hydra, which for 5 colorless and 1 green is a 6/6 Snake Hydra with Trample and Embalm for 3 generic and 1 green. The Embalm mechanic allows you to exile this card from your graveyard once it's there and put a token into play that's both white and a zombie, but a copy of Honored Hydra otherwise. This Snake Hydra is the real deal. A 6 mana 6/6 Trampler is already a solid playable card and would be enough for about a B-, but the fact that it comes with Embalm An extremely undercosted Embalm. It actually seems to be referencing an older card, Roar of the Worm, which is kind of cool, but it makes it a big problem for whoever has to play against it. It is hard enough to bring down a 6/6 Trampler profitably, doing it twice is even harder. The fact that this thing won't stay dead and provides you with two 6/6 Tramplers for the cost of one card makes it an incredibly powerful card and the kind of top curve you would love to have in basically every green deck. If you have some ways of discarding it early, you also get to have a 6/6 Trampler on turn 4. This card gets an A- for me and is a card I would love to start a draft with. Next, we have Hooded Brawler, which for 2 generic and 1 green is a 3/2 Naga warrior who says, you may exert Hooded Brawler as it attacks. When you do, it gets +2/+2 until end of turn. Hooded Brawler does an okay job on the vanilla test as a 3/2 and would be in the D+ or C- range if that's all it was. But it comes with some extra upside thanks to Exert. Unlike most 3-mana 3/2s, this one can still be rumbling later on in the game thanks to growing to a 5/4 when it needs to. Chances are attacking with it the turn after you play it will also be pretty effective. The Brawler is nothing exciting, but he's a solid 3-drop for a green deck, and I'm going to give him a C+. Next, we have Initiate's Companion, which for 1 generic and 1 green is a 3/1 cat that says, whenever Initiate's Companion deals combat damage to a player, untap target creature or land. Initiate's Companion does a decent job on the vanilla test as a 3/1 creature for 2 mana. It also comes with a bit of upside in that it allows you to untap creatures or lands when it does combat damage. This means it can either help you ramp a little bit or untap a blocker. The ideal thing is probably untapping a creature with Exert. However, this upside isn't going to come up super often just because a 3/1 can be blocked and killed by almost every card in this format. Still, it is a solid playable that gets moderately better if you have creatures with Exert, and I'm going to give it a C. Next, we have Manglehorn. 2 generic and 1 green mana for a 2/2 beast, which has, when Manglehorn enters the battlefield, you may destroy target artifact. And it also says, artifacts your opponent's control enter the battlefield tapped. This is a card that was clearly printed with Constructed in mind because it's not very good in this limited format. There aren't enough artifacts to mainboard this card, and it makes for an okay sideboard card, but I would honestly prefer Dissenter's Deliverance over it because of the cycling. So this amounts to an F as a mainboard card because basically you're just playing a 3-mana 2/2 with no text in its box, and about a C- as a sideboard card. Next, we have Mouth to Feed, which is a split card with the Aftermath mechanic. The part you can cast from your hand is 2 generic and 1 green mana for a sorcery, and it says create a 3/3 green hippo creature token. The other half has Aftermath, which means you can only cast that half from your graveyard and not from your hand, and it gets exiled when you do. And that half says draw a card for each creature you control with power 3 or greater. Some of the Aftermath cards are more ideal when you cast both halves at once, and others are better when you cast the first half in the early game and the second half in the late game. This is usually going to fall into a latter category. A 3-mana 3/3 is pretty nice, and you probably want to play that on turn 3. If you cast both halves at once, say you top deck it in late game, worst case scenario is that you pay 7 mana for a 3/3 that draws you a card, which is pretty bad, but if you have even one more 3-power creature in play, it does get a little more reasonable. But like I said, I think it is better to play Mouth in the early game if you can, and then build up your board and cast Feed when you're running out of gas to draw a few cards. An efficient creature on one side and a way to reload your hand in the late game on the other makes this card a B. I would be happy to pick this card up pretty early, even with a first pick. Next, we have Naga Vitalist, which for 1 colorless and 1 green is a 1/2 Naga Druid, and it taps to add to your mana pool 1 mana of any type that a land you control could produce. 2 mana dorks tend to be pretty good in most formats unless the format is blistering fast. For the most part, I don't think this format will be, as it looks pretty grindy to me, or at least of average speed, with mechanics like cycling and Embalm being mana sinks. Naga Vitalist is going to be good here because of those mechanics, and because she can ramp you into some of the bigger monsters in the format. Green has some quality 6 and 7 drops, some of which we've already discussed, more of which are to come. She also is sort of a bad source of fixing, but she can at least help you cast cards that have a double-colored mana cost, even if you only have 1 land that can produce that mana, and that doesn't hurt. Overall, I think Naga Vitalist is a C+. A card I can see first picking out of a very weak pack, and one I'm willing to start considering seriously around pick 6 or 7. Naga Vitalist wheeling is going to be a good sign that green is open, because it's just one of the best commons in the color. Next, we have Oashra Cultivator, which for 1 green is a 0/3 human druid, and it has an activated ability, which is 2 colorless and 1 green, and you tap it and sacrifice Oashra Cultivator, and you search your library for a basic land card. Put it on the battlefield tapped, and then shuffle your library. 1 mana for a 0/3 isn't exactly exciting, but Oashra Cultivator can at least block most of the 2-drops in the format, provided they aren't exerting themselves. Her main role is that of mana fixing. Her ability to search for a basic land and put it into play is nice, because if you pick up a cultivator and a few other sources of fixing, you can splash powerful off-color cards without too much trouble, and that's always a nice option to have. Still, I'm going to give her a C. She isn't something ultra exciting, though if you picked up a huge bomb rare that isn't in your primary colors at some point, she obviously goes up in value a little bit thanks to your desperate need for fixing. Next, we have Ornery Kudu, which for 2 colorless and 1 green mana is a 3/4 antelope, and it has when Ornery Kudu enters the battlefield, put a -1/-1 counter on target creature you control. This is another creature with -1/-1 counters. It gives you 2 decent options. One is that you have a 3/4 that shrinks one of your creatures, and the other is a 3 mana 2/3. What's more is in the black-green color pair, as I've mentioned, there are lots of ways of abusing -1/-1 counters. In most decks, it's just going to be a solid playable you're neither excited or sad about having in your deck, and because of that, I'm going to give it a C. Next, we have Pouncing Cheetah, which for 2 generic and 1 green is a 3/2 cat with Flash. Flash is a pretty awesome keyword ability because it gives you a lot more flexibility than most creatures allow. If you have removal or an activated ability you can play, leaving the mana up for those abilities and still having the option to cast a creature at the end of your opponent's turn is great. Flash also allows creatures to function somewhat as removal, as you can flash in this Cheetah to do something like block a 4/3, and that is usually a pretty good exchange for you. It certainly is an exciting card by any stretch, but it's a solid playable and I would feel fine about having one copy in basically every green deck I draft. I won't go out of my way to get them though, and think this will be easy to pick up in the latter half of the pack, which means I'm giving this card a C. Next is Prowling Serpopard, which for 1 generic and 2 green mana is a 4/3 cat snake, because that's a normal creature type, and it has Prowling Serpopard can't be countered, and creature spells you control can't be countered. A 3 mana 4/3 obviously does really well in the vanilla test, but everything else written on Prowling Serpopard is going to be irrelevant 99% of the time in limited. There are a few counter spells in this set, but they aren't going to be that heavily played. That said, based on its stats alone, I'm willing to give the Serpopard a C+, making it a solid playable for any green deck, but not one to really go out of your way for and take over premium removal or more high-quality creatures. This is a kind of card that can trick people into taking it, partly because of its rarity and because it seems to do so much, but trust me, it doesn't do as much as it seems like it does. Mostly, it will just turn sideways and attack your opponent. Next, we have Quarry Hauler, which for 4 mana is a 4/3, 3 generic and 1 green, I should say, is a 4/3, and it's a camel. And it says, when Quarry Hauler enters the battlefield, for each kind of counter and target permanent, put another counter of that kind on it or remove one from it. This is a pretty high quality common. 4 mana 4/3s are pretty solid and limited, and this one comes with a relevant enter the battlefield trigger, and a flexible one too. You can use it to add brick counters or +1/+1 counters, even loyalty counters if you happen to have a planeswalker, but you can also use it to remove a -1/-1 counter from a creature you control, remove a brick counter from an opponent's card that has brick counters, and so forth. This is some significant upside on a card that already has reasonable stats, and is enough for this camel to get into the C+ range, just because the fail case on this card is a solid 4/3 creature, and the upside it offers is very real. Don't take it early, but seeing it around by the middle of the pack is probably a decent sign that green is open, as this is one of green's best commons, and you should be snatching it up by then. Next, we have Ronis the Indomitable, who for 2 generic and 1 green is a 5/5 legendary creature, god, with Death Touch and Indestructible, and he says Ronis the Indomitable can't attack or block unless you control another creature with power 4 or greater. He also has 2 generic and 1 green for an activated ability that says another target creature gets +2/+0 and gains trample until end of turn. Well, here's our final god card to review. Ronis is pretty great, like they all are. He has the combination of both Death Touch and Indestructible, meaning that even if your opponent has a creature big enough to block this thing effectively, it is going to die anyway. Ronis' requirement to get him to attack, having power 4 or greater, basically the ferocious mechanic, isn't that hard to achieve either, because as long as you have a creature with 2 power, he can make it have 4 and turn himself into a 5/5 attacker or blocker. Ronis' ability is pretty nice too, as it can wreak havoc on combat. Your opponent will have a difficult time finding a way to profitably block if you have Ronis in play, are attacking with a couple of creatures, and you have 6 mana up. That said, Ronis' ability isn't the kind of ability that can single-handedly win games in the long run the way the abilities of the white, blue, and red gods can. Ronis needs to have creatures to be relevant, and because of that, he can be a pretty bad top deck. All that said, his ceiling is incredibly high, and I'm still willing to give him a B+, and concede that first picking this god is going to be right a significant portion of the time. Next, we have Sandworm Convergence, which for 6 generic and 2 green is an enchantment that says, creatures with flying can't attack you or planeswalkers you control. At the beginning of your instep, create a 5/5 green worm creature token. This card is the kind of card I want to win a game of Limited with, or several even, but at 8 mana, that's not an easy task. If you do play it though, you're just going to win the game since it offers a mode effect and an endless supply of 5/5s. There's a solid amount of ramp in this format, especially in the blue-green color pair, so winning with it sometimes will actually happen from time to time. I'm going to give the Convergence a C- because of its prohibitive cost, with the caveat that if you pick up some nice ramp, it becomes an incredible card in your primary win condition probably in your deck. Next, there is Scaled Behemoth, which for 4 generic and 2 green is a 6/7 Krokodil with hexproof. Scaled Behemoth is as great a 6-drop as you can get, basically, in a green deck, and if you can ramp into him, you will be even happier, as playing him on turn 5 is insane. Hexproof is powerful and basically means that the Behemoth can only die in combat, and usually with your opponent having to give up more than one card. If you're backing up with combat tricks, well, your opponent is probably just dead because they will just try to set up a block and kill him, and finally take him down, only to get completely blown out. Scaled Behemoth is a B, and a card worth considering taking with a first pick in many packs. Next, we have Shed Weakness. For 1 green mana, it's an instant that says, target creature gets +2/+2 until end of turn. You may remove a -1/-1 counter from it. This is a combat trick I can get behind. In general, I love 1 mana combat tricks that offer decent boosts, and +2/+2 qualifies as that, because this is the kind of stats boost that can result in your smaller creature smashing through a considerably larger one, and the low cost means you can probably do something else on your turn. What's more is if your deck has a -1/-1 counter thing going on, or your opponent has put them on your creature, this turns into Giant Growth, which is one of the best combat tricks ever printed for Limited. Still, combat tricks aren't for everyone. Aggressive decks will want this card and be happy with such a high quality trick, but that's not all decks. So I'm going to give this a C+, with the caveat that it may get all the way up into a B- range in an aggro deck. Next, we have Chefit Monitor, which for 5 generic and 1 green is a 6/5 lizard. He has cycling for 3 generic and 1 green, and he says when you cycle Chefit Monitor, you may search your library for a basic land card or a desert card, put it onto the battlefield, then shuffle your library. This is my least favorite card of the cycle of uncommons that do something when you cycle them. This is because all the other cards do some version of what they do when they are cycled when you play them too. In fact, they do smaller versions of the thing that actually happens when you cast them. Chefit Monitor doesn't. A 6 mana 6/5 is fine, but not ultra exciting when it does nothing else. I wish they had made it so that it at least search your library for basic land or desert and put it into your hand or something. Anyway, with that mini rant out of the way, this is still a solid card. You can count it as a source of fixing because of the cycling effect, and that's always a good thing to have. The ability to grab deserts is an okay thing to add to it, as there's 1 desert that can filter mana and add mana of any color, so it's fixing for everything. And some of them are actually playable. Some of the deserts, not all of them are, though. And as I mentioned, a 6 mana 6/5 is pretty beastly. Still, I think the card caps out around a C+, just because the actual casting of this card isn't very exciting, and you probably want to be cycling this one more frequently. Next, we have Sixth Sense, which for 1 green mana is an enchantment aura, and it says Enchant Creature. Enchanted creature has, whenever this creature deals combat damage to a player, you may draw a card. Sixth Sense is a color-shifted curiosity, and curiosity is generally not very good in Limited, and I don't think this will be either. Drawing cards is something I love, but you have to already have a creature that is built to use this aura, something that has an evasive ability or is difficult to block, and you just aren't always going to have that. You will frequently just have a couple of 2/2s in play, and they will never get in for combat damage. I'm willing to give this card a straight F and predict it'll be one of the last cards in many a booster pack, so don't play it. Next, we have Spidery Grasp, which for 2 generic and 1 green is an instant that says, untap target creature. It gets +2/+4 and gains reach until end of turn. Spidery Grasp grants a pretty significant number of things. It untaps a creature, so it creates a surprise blocker, and it gives a creature +2/+4, which is a big enough stat boost to survive basically all combat, and it gives the creature reach, which means it can go after flying creatures out of nowhere. Also, in this format, the fact that it untaps something is good with the exert mechanic. All that said, I generally don't like combat tricks that cost more than a mana or 2, just because the opportunity cost of leaving mana up is too high sometimes, and you would rather play a 3-drop than leave mana up for this thing. Additionally, I'm not a huge fan of combat tricks on defense. This is one that is geared more towards that between the untapping and the reach. The best combat tricks are good on offense, and while this one is serviceable, it is pretty expensive for an aggro deck to be throwing down. All that said, the thing is still playable if you fail to get much removal in your deck, and this is going to be your primary way of dealing with your opponent's biggest threats, but that means something has gone seriously wrong in your draft, which means this is a classic D. I'm going to give it a little bit of a boost because of the exert synergy and put it up to a D+, but still not a great card. Next, we have Stinging Shot, which for 1 green mana is an instant, and it says put 3 -1/-1 counters on target creature with flying. It also has cycling for 2 generic mana. Green always gets a quality sideboard card that really destroys flying creatures, and this is what it got in this set. However, I think this card is actually a reasonable mainboard card. Generally, hyper-efficient removal spells that only affect flyers are sort of close to playable anyway because most decks have at least a few flyers, and I would give this card a D or a D+ as a mainboard card, but that's if it doesn't have cycling, which it does. Thanks to cycling, you can run this mainboard and not feel very bad about it since it will frequently be able to kill or at least weaken one of your opponent's creatures, and when it can just replace itself. That pushes Stinging Shot all the way up to a C- for me in your mainboard and a B out of your sideboard. Still not ideal to have mainboard, of course, but there are plenty of worse options. Next, we have Synchronized Strike, which for 2 colorless mana and 1 green is an instant that says untap up to 2 target creatures. They each get +2/+2 until end of turn. This is another green combat trick that's sort of expensive, but I like this one. Anytime you have the option of pumping 2 creatures, I become interested, because it means you can manufacture 2-for-1 with this card pretty easily, and getting 2-for-1s is basically how you win a game of limited Magic. What's more is this card has some special synergy with creatures with Exert. Since it untaps a creature you attack with, you can sometimes get even more value out of the card because your Exert creature will no longer remain tapped on your next turn, meaning it can exert itself again, in addition to now being able to block. While this works okay as a defensive maneuver, it is far better offensively, making aggro decks the most interested in this card, especially those running Exert creatures. A quick word of caution though, that really applies to all combat tricks. If your opponent has mana up, think about whether or not they can interact in response and blow you out. Synchronized Strike helps you avoid this a little bit since you get to pump 2 creatures and not just 1, but ideally your opponent won't be able to interact with this at all. I'm going to give this a C+, just because it is going to be so good in aggro decks. In the most aggressive decks, it probably moves into a B-. Next, we have Trial of Strength, which for 2 generic and 1 green mana is an enchantment that says when Trial of Strength enters the battlefield, create a 4/2 green beast creature token. It also has, when a cartouche enters the battlefield under your control, return Trial of Strength to its owner's hand. So sometimes this is just going to be a 3 mana 4/2, which is pretty okay stats, but nothing special. If that's all it was, it would get a straight C. But with the cartouche upside, the idea of playing this multiple times and getting multiple tokens out of it is great, as that will grant you some pretty amazing card advantage. 4/2s can both attack and block pretty well, and if you get more than one of them from this card, you feel pretty good. That cartouche upside is enough to push this into the C+ range, but keep in mind that if your deck has 0 cartouches, this is probably a C. Next, we have the Vizier of Menagerie, who for 3 colorless and 1 green is a 3/4 Naga Cleric, and it says you may look at the top card of your library. You may do this at any time. You may cast the top card of your library if it's a creature card, and you may spend mana, as though or mana of any type to cast creature spells. We have a lot going on here, but I like all of it. A 4 mana 3/4 is right along what you expect to get, and all the extra text on this card is awesome. Looking at the top card of your library alone is a useful source of information, and one thing I like about this card, as opposed to other cards like it from Magic's past, is that your top card is not revealed as well to your opponent, meaning that your opponent isn't also gaining information, as is the case with most cards that let you do things with the top card of your library. The ability to sort of expand your hand to the top card of your library is good too. Now, you only get to do that if the top card of your library is a creature, but a good chunk of your deck will be creatures, so you'll get a few hits off of the Vizier. What's more is the Vizier provides you with mana fixing for your creatures. So if you're planning on splashing a god or a gold creature in your deck, he makes that plan much more viable. All of this stuff in his text box, combined with reasonable stats, results in Vizier of the Menagerie being a B+, a card that I would take early without hesitation, but isn't quite game-breaking on its own. Next, we have Watchful Naga, which for 2 generic mana and 1 green is a 2/2 and a Naga wizard, and it says you may exert Watchful Naga as it attacks. When you do, draw a card. I don't like this card very much. Again, I love drawing cards, but this just doesn't do that good of a job of doing it. It has a small body, so it won't be able to attack in a lot of board states, and will basically just be a 3 mana 2/2, which is pretty bad. I mean, I should note that you can attack with it just to draw the card, but when this becomes a 3 mana spell that draws you a card, that's not very good. It just doesn't feel like this card gives you enough for including such a subpar body in your deck, and because of that, I'm only going to play this card when I'm short on playables, and that means it's a D+. That does it for all of the green cards in Amonkhet. We've covered every monocolored card so far. Tomorrow, I will bring you the final video in my full set limited review, covering all of the cards that aren't monocolored, multicolored cards, artifacts, and lands. I will still have one more video coming out about Amonkhet Limited 2, more than one, but one more in the near future, my archetype guide, which will discuss in more detail the goals of various color pairs in this format and talk about the synergies that can be abused in each of them. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to hit the like button. If you disagreed with any of the cards I discussed, let me know in the comments below. Discussion is a good way of making us all better at Limited. Finally, if you want to make sure you catch the rest of this Limited review and future Limited reviews, as well as draft videos and crack-a-packs where I discuss the best first pick in each pack, don't forget to subscribe. Additionally, my content is sponsored in part by 5colorcombo.com, which is a great website for Magic players, especially if you like Limited. They offer an app on both Android and iPhone that allows you to practice drafting formats no matter where you are. You can also use my discount code NITZAHONE5 in their store to get a 5% discount. Thanks for watching.